The NFC South. It's like the NFC, but South. Or is it actually better, and will it rise again? Coming up next on the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast. Jeff Erickson here with Nick Whalen. We are brought to you by Fantasy Sports Knockout, Verse Fantasy, a new advertiser with us today, and, of course, Fantrax. Please patronize them. Please check out RotoWire, rotowire.com/pod to go get that free trial at RotoWire. We thank you for joining us today. Nick, we're back from Circa Radio Row, the Ultimate Contest sign-up weekend. We are ready and rocking to get back into the rhythm of the NFL season, previewing the NFC South today.
Looking forward to jumping back in. I mean, we have been all over the map, literally for the last week. Did a bunch of pods, a bunch of VSiN segments, live radio out in Vegas. Want to, of course, thank the Circa guys, led by Derek Stevens, Mike Palm, Aaron Oster for having us out there. Fantastic experience as always. I mean, this is year 3 of us going out for Ultimate Contest weekend, and very cool the way it continues to grow. Very humble beginnings a couple years ago, Jeff, when you and I literally comprised Radio Row ourselves. Gave us a nice spot, up above the sports book. But, this year we had, 40 plus outlets out there, just a really good time. Got to golf, got to hang out at the pool. You got to enter Circa Survivor. I got to enter Circa Millions. I got yet another very cool hat that does not fit my head, but I will be proudly displaying in our
I'm over 3 on those too, by the way. Yes, as far as
right. I know. I don't have the right head for this stuff. I need very specific hats for my small head, but nonetheless, looking forward to Circa Million. We'll be doing a bunch of content around that throughout the season. You can check it out over at Bookies Plus as well, our sister site. But this is all separate, Jeff. We need to get to the NFC South. I've just been salivating, waiting to preview this division.
Yeah, it's better than last year. I'll start with that. I think you can say that for at least 2 of the teams in the division, Atlanta and Carolina. You might not be able to say that about Tampa Bay and New Orleans. We'll see about that. But at the same time, I mean, there are real legitimate hopes for the Falcons. Minus 130 to win their division at DraftKings. Over under total of 9.5 this year. They fizzled out badly in the final week of the season, got beat by the Saints, beat badly by the Saints. Jameis Winston run up the score touchdown that Dennis Allen disavowed afterward, which was perfect. I thought it was a perfect fitting for the end of this season for both of those teams.
It was a perfect way for the NFC South to wrap up. I think, we had this pinpointed as, all right, somebody's got to make the playoffs out of this division, and it's probably going to be one of those years where 8 or 9 wins gets it done. And, it came down to week 18, but that was the case. Tampa Bay squeaking in at 9-8. You mentioned Atlanta. I think that's by far the most interesting team in this division. I do think Carolina will be better. I think the Bucs and the Saints are kind of right in that same zone that they were last season. Most of them just kind of running it back with the same talent. Atlanta's the team that's gone out and made sweeping changes, right? Not only do you have a new head coach, you got essentially a new coaching staff in general. You have a new quarterback in Kirk Cousins. Yeah. I mean, and just in the last couple of weeks, we've seen this team make even more win now moves, bringing in, a couple big names on that defense, which, quietly improved quite a bit, especially in terms of pass coverage last season. Jesse Bates ended up being a big hit for them in free agency. Obviously, you still have a great cornerback in AJ Terrell. You go out and get Justin Simmons. This has been, a team that I think, other than the Michael Penix pick, all they've been signaling to us is, hey, we view this as our window with Kirk Cousins. We think we have, 1, 2, 3 years here. We're going to do everything we can to capitalize on that. And, it's been completely losing my train of thought here, Jeff. It's been tantalizing is the word that I wanted to use for fantasy, because these guys that we've been, kind of lukewarm on, kind of down on the last couple of years, all of a sudden there's excitement around Kyle Pitts again. There's excitement around Drake London again. And I want to start with London because I think he's the most interesting one here, maybe other than Pitts. Are we going too hard on Drake London, Jeff? A guy who topped out at 905 yards last season. I think there's the promise of untapped potential here with Kirk Cousins. Right. Are we taking Drake London a little too early?
It is possible. I think it is possible. I'm pulling up like the latest, like the last week data on the NFFC and the RotoWire Online Championship. I always like going there as my ADP source. There's many other sources you can do, but he's 16 in the last week. There, it's tough to find a place where you can get him there any cheaper than that. He goes, that's wide receiver 10. And in the NFFC, it is a wide receiver centric type of league. It's three wide receiver slots and a flex, full point PPR. Wide receivers, underdog, they fly off the board even sooner. But, I think that Drake London was one of those guys like, okay, if you don't want to get Devontae Adams, if you don't want to get, one of the veterans, that London was your pivot. Now he's become a priority. And I get your concern. I think you're right. That is a little bit of a concern that maybe he is going too soon.
Right. And, part of it, like you said, in the NFFC specifically, is you have so many receivers being pushed up the board. So, despite him being, a guy with an ADP hovering around 15, 16 overall, you'll still see 8 or 9 receivers go ahead of him. So part of it is just the market on the wide receivers. And you are right. I mean, he is kind of in that zone with Marvin Harrison, Puka Nacua, Chris Olave, Devontae Adams. You do have to play favorites in that zone. And, I'm not a big Devontae Adams guy. Chris Olave, who we'll talk about in a little bit, I think has some of the same, floor ceiling type of questions as Drake London, although he's been a bit more consistent and has provided a higher floor over the last couple of years. Marvin Harrison, if you're willing to incur that risk, at the beginning of the second round, be my guest. That's somebody that I've said all offseason long. I just don't love drafting him at his ceiling. Not that he can't hit it, not that he's not, an elite prospect, not that he's not in a great spot in Arizona. I just don't. I feel like there's too much of a premium being placed on Marvin Harrison. And, if you're concerned at all about Puka Nacua, whether it's the bursa sack issue or, the return of a healthy Cooper Kupp, it still feels like a bit of a risk to take him at 15. So I think part of the reason that Drake London continues to fall in this zone is not only the excitement about this Atlanta offense, but the reservations about the other receivers in that group.
Yeah, exactly. I have another pivot. It's even I'm jumping ADP on Mike Evans.
Okay.
I took him in the second round in the Beat Jeff Erickson draft, which you can find on YouTube. You can find on wherever we do podcasts because I live streamed it as well. So you guys can check that out. But I took him in the middle of the second round. I took him over Olave. I took him over Adams. I took him over Kupp. One would argue that I reached a little bit there, and that's fine. Maybe I could have got him in the middle of the third, but I just think I never go wrong with Adams. He's always at 1,000-yard season. We'll talk about more about that later. This is the Atlanta pod or the Atlanta section of this podcast. But yeah, I do think there's a possibility we're going a little too early on to London. But then again, if you're in the early second round, you're not getting him in the third. So I guess that's kind of the point.
Yeah, it's an upside play. There's no question about it. I think on a per route, per snap basis, we like what we've seen from Drake London. And, I have plenty of Drake London. I'm in on it. I don't know that it's going to go down as a massive value because we need a huge jump in quarterback play, which should happen, I think, with Kirk Cousins. But, of course, there's a chance that it doesn't. I'd be a little more comfortable, if we could see Drake London, closer to that next tier of wide receivers, like, Cooper Kupp presents his own issues and his ADP continues to rise, by the way. You got to basically take Cooper Kupp at the end of the second round, maybe early third in some NFFC drafts, but in those high stakes leagues, he's going higher and higher. Like Nico Collins versus Drake London, Jalen Waddle versus Drake London. Those are interesting debates to me, but we're seeing London go, a full round ahead of Waddle. And, part of it is he's the clear number one in Atlanta, whereas, Jalen Waddle obviously is number two, but behind Tyreek Hill. Overall, though, I'm buying the Kool-Aid on Atlanta. I think they have far and away the highest ceiling of any team in this division. The other three, to me, it's like Carolina is still in rebuilding mode. I think you're just looking to see signs out of Bryce Young more than anything. This season isn't some sort of catastrophic failure if you only win 5 or 6 games. And, I think Tampa Bay and New Orleans, those teams they kind of cap out at a 10-win ceiling to me. Whereas you could sell me on the Falcons winning 11 or 12 games, especially with their schedule.
Yeah, I think you could make that argument for sure. Bijan Robinson versus Breece Hall. Who do you got?
I slightly prefer Breece Hall. That's where the market has trended as well. I mean, their ADPs are separated by about a half a pick right now in the NFFC. It's started to become more and more common, even in these wide receiver premium leagues, full PPR, that both of those guys go in the top 5, maybe sometimes even in the top 4, right? And we've talked about that at length on our Sirius XM show. I think part of it is the reservations you have about some of the receivers, the CeeDee Lamb situation not being settled, Jamar Chase still somewhat in limbo. Some people are just kind of out on Justin Jefferson now with Sam Darnold. So we've seen both Hall and Bijan Robinson get pushed up the board. I lean Hall. I think he has more of a true, full workload for the New York Jets. I think there is room for him to climb in terms of efficiency as a runner. I think he can make a huge jump there if this is a more competent passing offense, which by all accounts it should be. The Falcons keep trying to intimidate us and say, look, Tyler Algier is still going to be a big part of this offense. I'm not being completely scared off. If I have the 5th pick and Hall goes 4th and I want a running back, I'm still okay taking Bijan. But if it's up to me, I'm taking Breece Hall.
Yeah. Okay. I had that choice. I took Hall over Bijan at pick 6. I was surprised I had that choice of both of them. Still, you see in many leagues where they go back. I'm back in on Kyle Pitts. I just can't help myself. I took him again in the RotoWire Online Championship. He's my tight end 5. I have him just a notch ahead of Dalton Kincaid. Kincaid is now in the last week has moved up to tight end 4 in the NFFC, ahead of Andrews, believe it or not, just by a little bit. I would take Andrews ahead of Pitts. Ingram actually went ahead of Pitts in this draft too. He was tight end 7 in this particular draft. I'm ready to be hurt again.
Okay. As long as you know what you're signing up for and acknowledge that is a true possibility. I kind of thought we might see more of an ADP rise for Kyle Pitts than we have. It has stabilized over the last month or so. Like you said, Dalton Kincaid is now going a full round plus ahead of Kyle Pitts on average in the NFFC. Andrews still goes about 9-10 picks ahead. Pitts versus Ingram was a really interesting debate. Obviously Evan Ingram had 2 touchdown catches with the first teamers in the Jags final preseason game over the weekend. So I think there might be, a bit of an artificial boost there.
Sure.
I think Ingram still provides you the higher floor. Is he going to reach the target numbers, the overall catch numbers that helped him become the tight end 3 in PPR last year? Probably not. But I think there's a pretty clear path to him still finishing somewhere between the, tight end 5, tight end 8 range. Kyle Pitts certainly presents more variance. He presents more upside. No question about it. He's the more talented player. He's the more versatile player. And, I think ultimately you kind of have to view him as the wide receiver 2 for the Falcons. I think that's part of the appeal, right? Is they don't have the same depth questions that Evan Ingram does in Jacksonville.
Yeah, that's accurate. I was just going to ask you, my follow-up question is, we've got a narrow tree. Can I interest you in a Darnell Mooney? Can I interest you in any other of their other options late in drafts?
Mooney would really be the only other receiving option, that I would think about for Atlanta. And, he's wide receiver 61 right now. We're talking 12th, 13th round of your draft when you're just looking to, kind of add some depth to that receiver room. I think the cost is appropriate, though. Like, I wouldn't say he early in draft season, I felt like he was a monster bargain. And I think the market has corrected itself. He goes around the same range as guys like Dontavian Wicks, Mike Williams, who, is obviously an upside play, could go horribly wrong, but there is upside there. He's the wide receiver 2 for the Jets. Gabe Davis, AD Mitchell, Josh Downs, he's going to miss time, but should be a big part of that offense going forward. Like, there are other names that I like in that zone. So it's not like it's just an auto click on Darnell Mooney. But again, if you're in on Kirk Cousins, if you're in on this offense, I think it should be able to support, 2 wide receivers and then, borderline elite tight end in Kyle Pitts. And, I am still loading up. I'm using that term a little liberally, but I'm getting plenty of Tyler Algier is what I'll say late in drafts. And it's not because I think Tyler Algier is, going to have a 50-50 split with Bijan Robinson. I think a lot of that is just kind of messaging from the team, trying to kind of keep Algier in the mix. It's Bijan Robinson insurance. Whether I draft Bijan Robinson early or not, it's a very clear handcuff situation to me. And it's one that doesn't come at an exorbitant cost. You're firing darts at running back in that range anyway.
Final question on the Falcons before we move on. 9.5 wins, over or under?
I'll take the over. I think that's a reasonable number. It's a team with an easy schedule in and out of division. They found their way to 7 wins last year, lost at least 2 or 3 games that they probably should not have won. And if Kirk Cousins stays upright, I think he provides them with a high enough floor that this could be a 10 or 11 win team.
Carolina Panthers didn't play their offensive starters until this most recent preseason game, and they actually played pretty well against the Buffalo Bills. Bryce Young, cause for optimism here. He looked pretty good in that last preseason game.
He looked fine. Yeah, I'm generally optimistic that Bryce Young will take some steps forward. And we saw him really out there for limited action, 6 of 8 for 70 yards, did throw a touchdown. We like to see that. I don't think that we come out of this season with a dramatically different trajectory for Bryce Young, but to me, last year was a worst case scenario in a number of ways, right? It wasn't quite Urban Meyer in Jacksonville bad, but it was close, as far as setting up a number 1 overall pick to fail. I don't think, I think if he swaps places with CJ Stroud, do we feel as good about Bryce Young in Houston as we do Stroud? No, I don't think so. But I don't think, I don't think CJ Stroud even is able to surmount some of the issues in Carolina. I mean, you have a bad owner, you got a bad coach, you got a bad roster. I mean, I don't know what we really expected from Bryce Young, who had some, known limitations coming into last year. A lot of the questions we had about his mobility, his size, his ability to see things down the field, I mean, those all turned out to be legitimate concerns. And I think Carolina, feels like a more competent organization this time now than they did last year. They went out and at least attempted to address the offensive line issues that led to Bryce Young being sacked, I think, 62, 63 times last season. They paid big money for a bunch of guards. They drafted a tackle early in the draft as well. I mean, this is a team that I think at least acknowledges what went wrong last season, will take steps to insulate Bryce Young. And, adding someone like Deontay Johnson, it's not like you're bringing in A.J. Brown. It's not like we just, assume he has the star receiver now, but having a comfortable, relatively short yardage target like Deontay Johnson, I think that type of player makes sense to pair with Bryce Young.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because the biggest problem I thought Bryce Young had, in addition to running for his life, was that his receivers uniformly couldn't gain separation.
No.
Adam Thielen's, he's crafty. He's good. He had a good half a season.
Had an amazing start to the season. We got to give him that.
Yeah. But Mingo, Marshall, they couldn't do it. They just couldn't get open. I had higher hopes for Jonathan Mingo. It just didn't work out. But it should be an improved receiver room. They spent obviously the early pick on Xavier Legette. He's healthy now. He was hurt a little bit in training camp. I feel like Legette might be one of those guys that is a little behind because of the missed time in camp. So we'll see. I mean, he was dealing with the foot injury, missed like the initial preseason game. You had the depth chart hazing going on where Mingo was listed ahead of Legette. I think Legette will get there. I think that it's going to be tough to count on him doing much early on.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's still Deontay Johnson and Adam Thielen who are going to be out there in 12 personnel. And, I think Mingo versus Legette will be something that we have to watch very closely early on. But I don't think they just put Xavier Legette in the doghouse because he was banged up for a couple weeks in camp.
No, it's not a doghouse thing. It's right. It's development.
There's real investment here, right? I mean, they want Xavier Legette to be a part of this offense. So I think eventually he becomes the true wide receiver 3. It's like, can he get to the point where he is taking snaps from Adam Thielen? Maybe later in the year. We'll see. It really comes down to how much does Adam Thielen have left in the tank at this point. Does he look more like the guy from the first 6 or 7 weeks of last year, or more toward the end of the year? But, my guess is that this will be another developmental year for the Panthers, right? And, I always like to draw that NBA comparison where, you have a team like the Wizards and you're like, I don't really want any veterans on this team. I want the guys who are going to play more in the second half. And if I'm right about the trajectory for the Panthers, I don't see any reason why Legette won't be on the field more later in the year, right? Early on, I don't think he's going to be somebody that I'm considering starting in most fantasy leagues. You probably don't even have to draft him in your home league. We're talking 14th, 15th round, wide receiver 70. But in deeper leagues, I don't mind keeping him on the bench. And in shallower leagues, he's somebody that I want to keep a close eye on and kind of keep in my waiver wire queue early in the season.
The same holds true at the running back position, where we won't see Jonathan Brooks in week 1, most likely. He might still begin the year on the PUP list. They haven't made that decision yet. In fact, we had a note today that they haven't decided yet. I actually kind of view that as a little bit of a negative, because earlier on they were saying we won't see him till week 3. If they thought he was ready for week 3, that he would more outright say Jonathan Brooks won't begin the year on the PUP list. That's my read of that. I could be wrong.
Well, I think we'll get news on that soon. We got the Nick Chubb, PUP list news earlier today. I mean, obviously it's kind of coming down to decision time with week 1 starting up next week. So we'll know our answer in the next few days. I'm with you. I think they take a cautious approach here. I don't know what developments are going to happen in the next few days, that could keep him off of PUP. You could read it as encouraging that they want to give him as much time as possible. But even if he's not on PUP, I certainly would not expect him to be out there in week 1. We're probably talking several weeks into the year until he's, conditioned and worked back to the point where he's actually making an impact. So later in the year, he's certainly going to have an impact here. I think you could make the same case for him as I just did for Legette. As this year goes along, you want to see more and more of these young players that you're invested in. But I have plenty of Chuba Hubbard. I've been always impressed with, everywhere he's been, he's always produced, kind of found a way to win this job outright last season, despite starting further down the depth chart. Miles Sanders has completely fallen out of favor. And, Chuba Hubbard's cost, it's still pick 130 overall in the NFFC, probably even later in not less competitive drafts. I mean, RB 44, you're getting a starting running back for, in my opinion, probably at least half the season in Carolina. So he's been one of my favorite late round running back targets.
Yeah. I agree. I got him on Saturday night in the Beach F. Erickson draft. And, I also, excuse me, I also did get Chubb in that draft. I was hoping to get both Chubb and Ford, something I did earlier in the Sirius XM host draft. Maybe I should have done it the opposite, order, gone Ford first, then Chubb. Getting a little far afield, but then I added Hubbard 2 rounds later, and that worked out just fine. So kind of happy to see about that there. So we'll see. Any tight end of note here on this roster?
No, I don't think so. I'm just gonna give you a straight answer. I will say probably not. The top Carolina tight end is Jatavian Sanders right now, and he's drafted in about 30% of NFFC leagues, which are much deeper than your normal league. There's nobody to be really concerned about here. If you're a Jatavian Sanders guy, you can get him for free. You don't even have to draft him. But no, I mean, this is one of a handful of teams that just doesn't really have a tight end for fantasy consideration, and it's kind of a prove it situation, right? You don't have to make any level of investment in a Carolina tight end, and if somebody pops early on, then yeah, you go grab them on waivers. But nobody that I think we need to go deep on.
The Carolina Panthers have an over/under of 5.5 wins. Where do you stand?
5.5 wins. I'm going to go under. I think this is a 4 or 5 win team. That's still an improvement over last season. We're going to know relatively early. They have to go on the road at the New Orleans Saints in week 1. How competitive are they in that game? Can they steal a win at New Orleans? They're home for the Chargers in week 2. I think those are two really interesting tests because we're not really sure what to expect from the Saints. We have, we kind of know what we think the Chargers are going to be, but who knows how that game could go. They do get the Raiders in week 3. I mean, they have some winnable games on the schedule. They get the Commanders, they get the Broncos, but the schedule does stiffen up later in the year. So I just there are like 4 or 5 games to me that Carolina would like have to win in order to comfortably go over on this number. And my guess is that they probably split those. And there's a lot of games that I feel like they have almost no chance to win. So I'll go under on 5.5.
I'm going to go over.
Okay.
I'm bullish on this team. I think we're going to see a non-linear improvement out of Bryce Young. I think he's going to be much, much better this year.
All right.
And I think that leads the way. I think they protect him better. Defense, I'm a little concerned about. That's where I might have it. But I think I'm more bullish on the Panthers and less bullish on the Saints. So we'll see how that plays out there. And some of that is coaching a little bit there. We're going to talk New Orleans Saints next and why I'm a little down on them. But first, we have to catch up on a quick couple notes from our sponsors, starting off with Verse Fantasy. Why wait all season to win in fantasy? With Verse Fantasy, you can cash in every week. Download the Verse app, sync your fantasy league, and start wagering and winning today. Verse Fantasy is the new way to play fantasy. There's no need to draft a new team or bring your league to a new platform. Simply sync your current league from ESPN, Sleeper, or Yahoo into the Verse Fantasy app and instantly get money lines and spreads for your league's matchups that week. Enter the arena this season with Verse Fantasy and use promo code ROTO to get a 100% deposit match up to $50 when you sign up. All right. We're also sponsored by the good friends at Fantrax. You can go to Fantrax and, with Fantrax, is there something you wish your fantasy league had or features that are missing from your current leagues? Bonus scoring, custom schedules or playoffs, deeper team settings? Well, look no further because we have you covered with our friends at Fantrax. Fantrax is the most customizable fantasy platform in the industry, offering the greatest fantasy experience for your dynasty, keeper, redraft, and best ball leagues. Fantrax even offers college fantasy football leagues. Create or join a fantasy football commissioner league, invite your friends, and dominate your draft this season. Fantrax is the top dynasty fantasy football platform in the industry. Coming from another service? Not a problem. Fantrax can easily import any of your current leagues and rosters. Ever have a trade go wrong or make a mistake in dropping a player? Fantrax commissioner tools allow you to undo any move with one simple click. Fantrax is running a special promotion you don't want to miss. Sign up for free at fantrax.com/rotowire today to enter for your chance to win tickets to any regular season NFL game for you and your entire league, plus $6,000 in spending cash. That's right, tickets for your entire league. Simply create a new league or bring over your existing leagues for more chances to win. Go to fantrax.com/rotowire and sign up today. Fantrax, the home of fantasy sports. All right, let's talk a little New Orleans Saints. they have a new offensive coordinator this year. It's the same old quarterback. They don't have Michael Thomas anymore. So that part has changed. But this is a team that it seems to me to be as close to being the same as last year.
I feel that way as well. And, you're relying a lot, I think, on a coordinator change to, pump some much needed liveliness into this offense and, kind of steer Derek Carr away from just the checkdown raid that has come to define the New Orleans Saints. And, that was great for Alvin Kamara last season. If we're talking number of targets, number of catches, now the efficiency on those catches was not what we were looking for.
No.
He's a guy that's typically sat in the high 8s, low to mid 9s in terms of yards per reception throughout his career. He was down to 6.2 last season. But if you're in a PPR league, you didn't care because he had 18 more catches last season than he did in 2022. And that was in 13 games. Alvin Kamara, 75 catches in 13 games, turned only one of those, however, into a touchdown. So, I think Kamara is in some ways polarizing. In some ways, you kind of know who he is. To me, I just want to see, where does that volume come in this season? Do they have another back who really threatens Alvin Kamara? Early in draft season, I was kind of all in on Kendre Miller being that guy. I liked some of the advanced numbers on him. Did not like the advanced numbers on Kamara. And, Kendre Miller has basically missed all of training camp and the entire preseason with a hamstring injury. I mean, it got to the point where Dennis Allen was so fed up with it that he basically threatened to cut Kendre Miller. So I think for the time being, we just kind of have to fall back on this being Alvin Kamara's backfield. They do still have Jamal Williams, who we never talk about. He was the David Montgomery 2 years ago when he vultured 17 touchdowns in Detroit, was banged up last year, just never really found his stride. But I think you can expect a little bit more from him. The receiving core is appealing, right? I mean, this is Chris Olave and Chris Olave alone. There's some Rashid Shaheed excitement. And, I think given where he goes in drafts, I'm in on that. A much more appealing target to me in best ball where you get the spike weeks. I do think there's still going to be a decent amount of volatility week to week with him. Can they get A.T. Perry more involved? A guy who I've always been kind of fascinated with, a good jump ball receiver, good size. Just not having the Michael Thomas question hanging over this team is nice. Right. Not that it's really even mattered. It hasn't mattered in like 3 or 4 years for fantasy, but there was always this thing in the back of your mind of like, man, if you can stay healthy, now we just don't even have to worry about that.
Yeah. That's right. And it's interesting because at the panel I did at Circa on Saturday, one of the questions asked of the panel was, who's your odds on bet for first coach to be fired? And Mike McCarthy was brought up. Brian Daboll was brought up. Both good questions. Both, I think, good responses. I threw a curveball and said Dennis Allen. I think he kind of lost this team at the end of the year last year. Yeah. I think that they've already had to change offensive coordinators. I think they're one step away from that. I just remember games where his game management skills weren't great. I didn't like how he threw like Jameis Winston under the bus on that season-ending touchdown. Arthur Smith losing his mind because the Saints piled on the touchdown late, and yet the whole team was rallying around Winston. I mean, kind of read the room, coach. I mean, it's just I don't know. This seems like a non-coach's player. I don't know. I don't. I think that there's some bad juju, some bad vibes coming out of the Saints this year.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, the first sign of a coach who kind of recognizes that things might not be going the right way is, making a coordinator change, right? And, some teams will just go and outright fire the head coach, but that almost feels like a warning sign of like, all right, hey, we're not firing you, but we're firing the guy directly below you. And if this guy doesn't work out, you're probably next on the list. Our friends at bookies.com do have first coach fired odds up. Okay. These are about 2 weeks old, so it shouldn't be too many changes. Brian Daboll 3-1, Matt Eberflus plus 450, Dennis Allen plus 550. You could honestly, if you could find this somewhere, there's probably going to be better odds out there, I would imagine, than plus 550. But I think that's a great call because the Saints are one of these teams that are not that good, but probably expect to be better than they should, right? Like, Matt Eberflus, I think the Bears would have to be really like a true disaster to begin the year. Like there are expectations there for Chicago, right? But it's also year one under Caleb Williams. Like I don't think if the Bears start the season 1-3, all of a sudden, like, Matt Eberflus is canned. Maybe if they start the season like 2-6, that could happen. But I think the Bears kind of understand that, if they don't win 10 games this year, it's not a catastrophic failure. But, I feel like you're kind of implying that, there's a world here in which the Saints really do crater. Maybe they finish fourth in this division. If that happens, if they finish behind Carolina, there's no way Dennis Allen makes it through the season.
Right. And you know what? I think the Eberflus is interesting too. I mean, we look at Frank Reich last year as, rookie quarterback 1.1, the team is floundering. You got to do what you can to kind of salvage the quarterback. You salvage, you blame the coach, obviously. If
Well,
that happens.
you also have an ultra volatile owner in David Tepper,
That's also
where
true.
it's like the Bears, the Bears are the Bears, but they at least operate on a little more logic historically.
Yeah, they don't usually do in-season firings, and I don't
No,
think the Cowboys do either, which is interesting.
not
Also, with
often, no.
McCarthy. No, so I think that's it. Going back to the Saints on their personnel groups, we're still Taysom Hill is actually getting a lot of like tiny little positive buzz. Juwan
Yeah.
Johnson has, been banged up. He's back now, but I wouldn't be surprised if Hill is in the mix again. And he's actually literally lining up at tight end this year.
Yeah. No, you can't be surprised, right? I mean, we go through the song and dance with Taysom Hill every year. Everybody feels kind of dirty about it, and the way they use him is always a point of contention in fantasy. But 2 years ago, he finished as the tight end 9 in PPR. Last year, he finished as the tight end 12, right? And you're still not paying that price. He's going behind Pat Freiermuth. He's going behind TJ Hawkinson, who's going to miss time to begin the year. He's going, a full round or two behind someone like Dallas Goedert. So I get it. If you've kind of missed out on the tier of tight ends who you feel good about, if you're a little bit skittish like I am of approaching TJ Hawkinson or even Pat Freiermuth, he's kind of had some up and down buzz throughout the preseason. Yeah, I would still take Dalton Schultz over Taysom Hill. You're just kind of pinning your hopes on red zone opportunities for Schultz. But, again, Taysom Hill has a long track record of overperforming his ADP, and there's a good chance he'll do it again this year.
Yeah. I think there it is a good chance of that. We kind of just glossed over the receiving room, actually. I know Chris Olave is middle of the second round. I think he's, I have some concerns. I think the new coordinator will help because, at least there'll be more pre-snap motion, we think. We'll see some more of a modern offense as opposed to the turgid offense that they ran last year there. But Rashid Shaheed is your number 2, and he used to be just kind of a downfield and special teams specialist. Now they're really counting on him to do a lot more in the route tree. After that's A.T. Perry, who may have some upside. Cedric Wilson, Equinemius St. Brown. Those guys really don't have the upside that you're looking for there. So still pretty narrow tree again.
Yeah, it is, and I think that works to the advantage of Chris Olave, who last year was kind of the Alvin Kamara of receivers in some ways, where it's like the targets were there, but what were the quality of those targets? Still brought in 87 catches, over 1,100 yards, but it never really felt like Chris Olave and Derek Carr were on the same page. It was like a begrudging 1,100 yards from Chris Olave. So I think there is more there. We saw his yard per reception drop by about 1.6 last year. He should be able to kind of return that to where he was as a rookie in 2022. And everything you read about Chris Olave this offseason has been pretty positive. As far as the work that Olave has put in. A guy who kind of felt a little bit miffed, I think, as far as where he falls in the NFL hierarchy among receivers. I think he views himself closer to that top tier maybe than we do in fantasy. But even with all the questions we have about New Orleans, part of the reason that Chris Olave goes where he does is, again, there's not really a true number 2 threat. It's like, Juwan Johnson and Taysom Hill, they're kind of these gadgety pieces at tight end. Neither of those guys are, we don't talk about them the way we talk about Kyle Pitts, somebody who can line up at receiver and hurt you. And, Rashid Shaheed to me is an upside play, no question, but also not a guy who has, any real track record of, being a true number 2. He's always kind of been the big play threat, like you said. And, the big games are going to be there. Like his classic, like 3 for 150 with a touchdown. We're going to see those like we do every year. The question to me is like, can he start to be a, 6 catches for 88 yards type of player? Because historically it's always been, the one big play and then maybe you get one more short catch. Can he turn into a true, not possession receiver, but more than just the gadgety, run straight as fast as you can down the sideline guy?
Yeah, I think that's the question for sure. I don't have a whole lot of Shaheed. I've got him in a couple places, but I'm not comfortable with him being a starter for me. That means wide receiver or flex. He would have to be like my top bench receiver, my personal wide receiver 5, preferably even wide receiver 6. Is the way I'd look at it there. Over under on the Saints, 7.5 wins for you. What say you?
7.5, man, that feels like a low number. My default would be to go over on that. I got to take a closer look at the schedule. I'll go over. I think that this is probably a 7-10, 8-9 team. There's enough talent here. There's enough opportunity in division, I think to win 3 or 4 games. I don't think that's out of question for the Saints. I think the schedule late in the year is pretty advantageous as well. They get the Giants, they get the Commanders, they get the Raiders, they get the Broncos at home. Obviously, you get 2 against Carolina. There's just enough winnable games here that I'll go over on New Orleans.
False. You're going to go under. No, I'm just saying.
Okay.
I'm not saying false, but I'm going under on the Saints. I think they're a 6-win team. I think they're going to be a super disappointing. Maybe I'm just all anti Dennis Allen. That has something to do with it there. But I think this is a bad team. We'll see. I could be proven wrong. The division's soft enough that it's like one of those weird, a weird bounce sort of game swings this one way or another.
Oh yeah. I'm with you, man. Like you could absolutely talk me into the under. I think if I'm going over, I think they beat it by a half game. I think if they go under, they lose it by a half game.
Fair enough. All right, we're going to talk a little Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but first, quick note from our friends over at Fantasy Sports Knockout. Fantasy Sports Knockout, where a fantasy league meets a knockout pool. An innovative take on fantasy football. The concept is simple. Choose a new fantasy lineup each week and score points the same way you would in any fantasy league. But you must choose your players wisely. You can only use each player one time. The lowest weekly score or group of scores is eliminated from the contest every week. The concept may be simple, but survival is not. How will you play? Load up early or play the matchups and save the better players for later? Fantasy Sports Knockout. Can you survive the fantasy? Sign up at play.fantasysportsknockout.com today. We're also on the Blue Wire Network. Here are their ads. All right. Thank you for your patience there. We're going to talk about one more team, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. When we last saw them, they won a playoff game against the Eagles, and they took the Lions all the way to the wire in Detroit to get to the NFC Championship game. After this, no one expected anything from this team, and yet nobody expects a whole lot from them this year too. They lost Dave Canales. He's now the head coach, for another team. He's gone. So you lose your offensive coordinator. Everybody says Baker's 1 year on, 1 year off. What do you expect out of this Bucs team?
It comes down to Baker Mayfield, man. I think part of the reason that we had relatively low expectations last season was Baker Mayfield's track record, and it went about as well as it could have last season. But, we've also seen Baker Mayfield have these kind of spikes throughout his career, and it's typically followed by another season where it's not quite as impressive, right? You think 2020 with the Browns threw for, 3,500 yards, 26 touchdowns, 8 picks. The next year, he's back to kind of looking like the previous version of Baker Mayfield. And I think they've insulated him in Tampa Bay certainly better than he was during his Cleveland days. I mean, part of that was just the franchise around him was such a mess. And, Tampa Bay's been a better organization, and, you're basically bringing back all of the pieces that matter in this offense. So I think there's reason to believe that what Tampa Bay did last season is replicable. But at the same time, I also think there's a pretty defined ceiling on this team. I would be pretty surprised if they make it out of wild card weekend. I think they obviously caught the Eagles at the perfect time last season, but did put in a good effort, against Detroit, made that a game when it felt like there were a couple times the Lions were ready to close it out. A lot of polarizing players on this offense when it comes to fantasy. Are you in on Rachaad White after the breakout last year? I know you were all in, as you mentioned, on Mike Evans. I've traditionally been a Mike Evans guy. I think it's a little odd that all the concerns we had about his age last year, now tacking another year onto that, have just completely vanished. But maybe the reason for that is nobody has been more consistent than Mike Evans over the last decade at receiver. So if you look at the numbers, there's almost nothing that would sway you away from Evans other than the age.
So we figured this out yesterday when I was doing VEASAN. The last time Mike Evans did not have a 1,000-yard season was his senior year in high school. It was the first year he played football, and he averaged 25 yards per reception, but he played for like a 1-8 team or something like that. It was his first year. He also averaged like 25 points a game in basketball. So basically he was this sick athlete. They finally decided to play football for the first time. 1,000-yard seasons at A&M. He's never not had a 1,000-yard season in the NFL. Player prop is 1,000.5 receiving yards over at Circa. I would smash the over on that if you're so inclined. Anyways, going back to your point about Baker Mayfield, I think a lot of the reason for his fluctuation is injury. Like, remember, he tried to play through injuries in Cleveland.
True.
And as we've seen with Cleveland, they're not exactly great at diagnosing or disclosing injuries. If they say a player's got a little bit of an owie, he's probably got a torn rotator cuff. That's the way I look at it there. So I'm I'm in on Evans. I think Baker's free. I think their offensive line has improved. You saw their rookie center who's starting for them. I think that's going to improve this line. Remember, offensive line was their big concern coming into last season. It got better as the season went on. The Graham Barton is the kid that I'm talking about, by the way, who's starting at center. He turned a lot of heads in the preseason. I think this is going to be a better team. I am very bullish on the Bucs. Take my pessimism on the Saints and give me optimism on the Bucs.
Okay. Are we optimistic enough that this team could unseat Atlanta and win the division?
Unseat? Atlanta wasn't seeded yet.
You know what I'm saying? Well,
I know. No, I know. I'm kidding. I'm giving you a hard time, but I'm just saying it's like. But you're right though. The perception is, Atlanta is the clear favorite.
Right.
The Bucs are either 7.5, 8.5 wins wherever you look. This is the team that almost beat Detroit in the playoffs. That they had the lead in the second half in that game. I think that this is a team that is underrated by a good margin. I mean, they're going to have to play a tougher schedule this year. That's part of it. But I do think that they're a team that I think is overlooked. And some of it's just because they lost Dave Canales. Some of it's numerology. Rachaad White. Okay. Rachaad White. We haven't talked to him that much yet. A lot of the talk is, okay, he's a volume guy. He's not that good. They have Bucky Irving. I think they got a better line. I think he'll be more efficient as a back this year.
I would hope so, because the efficiency is still the question with Rachaad White. If you look at some of the PFF numbers, the Buccaneers were way near the bottom of the league in terms of run blocking, in terms of overall run scheme. Rachaad White, despite having by far his best season, still only averaged 3.6 yards per carry, was actually more effective on a per carry basis in 2022. And of course, what he did out of the backfield, 64 catches on 70 targets. Now that's efficient with 3 touchdowns. I mean, that was part of the reason he had the fantasy season that he did. And it took him a little bit to get going, really hit his stride, starting like week 7, week 8, essentially became a guy who was giving you a minimum of 17, 18 PPR points per week and was able to carry that through the fantasy postseason. He finishes the RB4, Jeff, in total value in PPR behind only McCaffrey, Hall, and Travis Etienne. So when you put it that way and say, okay, he was the RB4 last year, he's now being drafted as the RB13. It's surprising to me that there hasn't been maybe more of an overreaction to last season. And I think that fits the general narrative of relative skepticism on Tampa Bay overall, right? There's a reason their win total is where it is. There's a reason the Falcons have the number they do to win the division. I mean, in your mind, would you take Rachaad White over Josh Jacobs? Should he be closer to Isaiah Pacheco, who's now put 17, 18 spots between those two in ADP?
That's a great question, because I love Pacheco. I think, you talk about props. I love the Pacheco rushing prop of 900.5 yards. Again, at Cirque, if you want to bet over Cirque in the player props, generally you want to kind of shop around, but Circa seems to is a good place to bet overs. I've noticed there.
A lot of fair prices at Circa.
Yeah. Agreed. To answer your question though, no, I like Pacheco and Jacobs. I think Pacheco and Jacobs should be closer together. That's the one that kind of surprises me, is there's that big of a gap. I think White is fairly priced. I actually think Kyron Williams might go a little too soon. Achane might go a little too soon, but I don't think it's a grand insult to say White is RB13. I would take him ahead of Cook, ahead of Mixon, ahead of Walker, the ones after him. I'm fine. I kind of fine with where he goes, to be honest, because he does have a better backup this year, presumably in Bucky Irving. Last year, for a hot minute, people were declaring it Sean Tucker season. That never happened. Chase Edmonds season. No, that never happened. So I think he does have marginally, if not more than marginally, maybe just better backup, better competition for carries.
Yeah, and that's really the only thing that would concern me, because I think there is room for that efficiency to rise if this offensive line is better than it was last season. And I think if they stay healthy, if they can get that production out of the rookie center, then there's a world in which that happens. It's just, how much do they make a point to work Bucky Irving into the mix? Because part of the reason White had the year that he did is they never had a true backup, right? It was Rachaad White and Rachaad White only, especially down the stretch, Jeff. I mean, you look at starting in week 13, 20 carries, 25 carries, 21 carries, 20 carries, even late in the season, in Carolina in week 18, 19 carries, 18 carries against Philly in that wild card game. For fantasy, that's fantastic. For real life, don't really see a lot of teams that want to give one back 20 plus carries for a month straight. I do think Bucky Irving takes away from that a little bit, but again, you're not paying anywhere close to last season's production price for Rachaad White. I'm not willing to jump ADP for him because I think there is a world in which he does regress, but I think as the RB13, if I can get him as my RB2, totally fine with it. I'm not super comfortable with him as my RB1, however.
I think that's fair. I did do that in the RotoWire Invitational, but that's just because of the way I was drafting. I went receiver to start, so that was kind of how I drafted. Scheduling, it's not that bad for a first place schedule. You think, okay, that might be really awful, but I'm looking at their schedule, and first of all, they get to play the AFC West as their cross, so that means at the Chiefs. That stinks, but Chargers, Raiders, Broncos, okay, I'm fine with all of those on my schedule. They play the NFC East also, so that means they get the Giants, they get the Commanders. They get a home game against the Eagles. We saw how that happened last year. They won't be afraid of the Eagles. The Eagles should. I know you're big on the Eagles coming back to the flock, if you will, but they won't be intimidated by that game, assuming they get off to any sort of reasonable start. They got a game at the Lions. That'll be tough. They get the Niners this year, so there are some tougher games on their schedule, but they get 6 games in their own division. They get those other 3 AFC West games. They've got some winnable games, is my point.
Yeah, including week 1 against the Commanders at home. I think that would be a sneaky survivor spot. I'm not saying I would feel great about it, but if you don't want to, just kind of eat the chalk and take the Bengals, and you're looking for another spot to potentially play, I think anytime you have a rookie quarterback going on the road in his first NFL start, that's usually going to favor the home team and the veteran team and the Buccaneers. So I think they have a chance to get off on the right foot. I mean, the rotational non-divisional schedule is tough. That's where the first place finished last year, kind of hurts them a little bit. It's like you get the Ravens midway through the year. You get the 49ers. Both those games are at home, which is nice, but you're going to be home dogs, you would think, in both of those. They have to go to Dallas late in the year. Who knows where the Cowboys will be at that point. And like you said, getting the Eagles at home is big as well. They go to the Lions in week 2. I really think the Buccaneers fall about where they did last season. I think this could be as high as a 10-win team. It could be as low as a 7-win team. What is the official number right now at DraftKings?
So DraftKings at 7.5, but heavily juiced to the over at -150. At FanDuel, it's 8.5. Same with BetMGM. So you can see there's not a solid consensus opinion. One of the rare teams where you can kind of get a little bit of variance there.
Yeah.
Play whichever number you prefer. But we'll say for the sake of argument here, it's the 7.5, but you have to pay the juice. What say you?
In that case, I think they can get to 8 wins. I like this team better than I do New Orleans. I like the coaching staff. I think the players actually like their coach as opposed to New Orleans. Like that is it's somewhat of like this intangible thing, especially when it comes to fantasy. But Dennis Allen, you mentioned it. I mean, just bad vibes all around. Doesn't seem like a fun guy to play for. Doesn't seem like he has like his players' best interest in mind at all times. So I think the vibes are better in Tampa Bay. I think if we get another healthy season out of Mike Evans, I think this could be at least an 8-win team. I think this should be a nice bounce back year for Chris Godwin as well. We remember his wife we had to speak up on his behalf midway through last season. There's been more talk about using him in a slot role where he's more comfortable and has been more productive in years past. Give me the over on 7.5. I'll eat the juice there. And honestly, at 8.5, I would even consider the over there. But 8 wins is where I feel comfortable for Tampa Bay.
Yeah, as you can tell by how I've been talking about the Bucs, I'm definitely on the over for them. Even if you get it at 8.5, you'll get a better payout too if you choose to go that route too. So if you feel strongly about that, you take the higher payout, go with the higher number there. It's a way you could go ahead and approach that there. All right, that's going to wrap up the NFC South. Hang around. Don't hang in this specific room, but we are going to do another stream. We're going to do the NFC West coming up next in about 7 minutes. So thanks for everybody for tuning in. Thanks to our awesome sponsors. That's Fantasy Sports Knockout, First Fantasy, and Fantrax. If you like this podcast, please hit that like. Please subscribe. Check out RotoWire, rotowire.com/pod. You can check out the free trial. And of course, we want you to subscribe to RotoWire eventually. Check out all of our work there. Thanks for listening. We'll be back shortly with the NFC West.